March 8, 2019, Lieutenant. Commander Rebecca Hayes stood in the Combat Information Center of the USS Theodore Roosevelt when a senior captain ordered her to leave her sonar station and go make coffee for the real officers. Just as her screen detected an anomaly 340 feet below the surface that every other operator had missed. She had 90 seconds to choose between obeying a direct order from a man who'd never trusted female officers in combat roles, or trusting the classified anti-submarine warfare training that had made her the Navy's most lethal submarine hunter. But when she refused to move and locked onto what she knew was a hostile contact, would her disobedience prove she'd just saved 5,000 lives or end her career in disgrace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something even more powerful for you. The Arabian Sea churned beneath an overcast sky as the USS Theodore Roosevelt, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier displacing 100,000 tons, cut through international waters 180 nautical miles southwest of the Strait of Hormuz. It was 0340 hours, the dead zone of the morning watch, when fatigue settled into the bones of even the most disciplined sailors out inside the Combat Information Center, the carrier's nerve center. A dozen sailors monitored glowing screens in near darkness. The blue-lit space hummed with the constant whisper of ventilation systems and the occasional beep of radar updates. This was the CIC, where every threat to the carrier battle group was detected, analyzed, and neutralized before it could become a problem. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Hayes sat at Console 7, her eyes scanning the waterfall display of passive sonar returns. She'd been on watch for 3 hours, her fourth consecutive night shift this deployment. Theodore Roosevelt was leading a carrier strike group through one of the most contested waterways in the world, a region where submarines from multiple nations prowled beneath the surface. Testing American resolve and capabilities, Rebecca had been looking forward to this deployment for reasons she couldn't discuss with most of her shipmates. She'd only been back aboard the Roosevelt for 11 days after spending 9 months at an undisclosed training facility. The orders had simply read, Temporary Additional Duty, Special Warfare Development Group, with a classification level that prevented even her commanding officer from asking questions. What those 9 months had involved was the most intensive anti-submarine warfare training the United States Navy could provide. She'd worked alongside intelligence analysts who could identify specific submarine classes by the sound of their propeller cavitation. She'd trained with former submarine commanders who taught her to think like the enemy, to anticipate their tactics and exploit their limitations. She'd spent hundreds of hours in simulators facing scenarios that most SW officers would never encounter in their entire careers. The training had transformed her from a competent sonar technician into something far more dangerous to any submarine that dared approach an American carrier. But all of that expertise remained locked behind security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. As far as the Navy's official records showed, she'd been on a routine training assignment, learning new software systems and updating her qualifications. Hayes, you still awake over there? The voice cut through her concentration. She glanced up to see Lieutenant Marcus Shepard, the Assistant Tactical Action Officer, leaning against a nearby console with a coffee mug in hand. Wide awake, sir, Rebecca replied, her eyes returning to her display. Just monitoring the usual clutter. Anything interesting? Negative. Commercial traffic bearing 270 biologics scattered throughout the area, and the usual thermal layers playing games with our effective range. Shepard nodded and moved on to check other stations. Rebecca appreciated that he asked rather than assumed. Not everyone in the CIC extended that courtesy, especially not to the only female officer on the watch rotation. The door to the CIC opened, and Captain Douglas Merrick entered, bringing with him the energy of someone who'd been awake far too long, but refused to show weakness. He was the carrier's chief of staff, a former surface warfare officer with 26 years of service and a reputation for old-school naval tradition. That tradition, Rebecca had learned quickly, included some firm opinions about women serving in combat roles aboard warships. "Status report," Merrick announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The tactical action officer, Commander Patricia Thornton, stepped forward from her position near the command chair. "Sir, all contacts are classified and tracked. Air picture is clear. Subsurface environment shows normal commercial traffic and biological activity. No threats to the strike group at this time." Merrick walked slowly through the CIC, stopping at various stations to examine displays over the shoulders of junior officers and enlisted personnel. His inspection style was deliberate, looking for any sign of complacency or error. When he reached Rebecca's station, he stood behind her for a long moment, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he said, his tone carrying something that wasn't quite friendliness. "Still playing with your sonar toys." "I see. Maintaining situational awareness of the subsurface environment, sir," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice professional and her eyes on her screen. "Find anything worth reporting in the past 3 hours?" "Nothing beyond routine contacts, sir. The thermal layer at 200 feet is creating some interesting propagation effects, but nothing that impacts our detection capability." Merrick leaned closer, examining her display. "You know, in my day, we didn't rely so heavily on computers and automation. We trusted our instincts and our experience. All this technology just gives junior officers a false sense of capability." Rebecca said nothing. She'd learned that some comments didn't deserve responses, especially from senior officers who'd already formed their opinions. "How long have you been qualified as a tactical action officer, Hayes?" 2 years, sir." 2 years, Merrick repeated, as if the number confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And before that, you were what?" "A surface warfare officer who decided to play with submarines instead." "I cross-trained into anti-submarine warfare 3 years ago, sir. My previous qualification was in air warfare." "Cross-trained," Merrick said, the word carrying mild contempt. "In my experience, officers who can't excel in one warfare area often try to find easier paths in others." Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her professional composure. "I pursued SW because I found the challenges compelling, sir." "Compelling," Merrick echoed. He straightened up, addressing the room more broadly. "You know what I find compelling? Officers who understand that warfighting is serious business, not an academic exercise or a career diversification strategy." Several sailors shifted uncomfortably at their stations. Commander Thornton cleared her throat diplomatically. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Hayes has an excellent service record and strong qualifications in. I'm sure her paperwork is impressive." Merrick interrupted. "Paperwork always is. But when it comes to real combat situations, when lives are on the line and split-second decisions determine who lives and dies, I trust experience and proven capability, not diversity initiatives and experimental training programs." The words hung in the air, their implication clear to everyone in the CIC. Rebecca felt the eyes of other watchstanders on her. Some sympathetic, others simply curious about how she'd respond. She chose silence. Engaging with Merrick's prejudice would accomplish nothing except giving him ammunition to claim she was emotional or unprofessional. Instead, she returned her attention to her sonar display, where the waterfall of acoustic data continued its endless scroll. Merrick waited a moment, perhaps expecting a reaction. When none came, he moved toward the coffee station in the corner of the CIC. "Hayes, since you're so good at monitoring routine contacts that apparently never amount to anything, why don't you make yourself useful and brew a fresh pot of coffee? The watch team could use some proper refreshment." The request landed like a slap. Around the CIC, several sailors suddenly found their displays intensely interesting. Unwilling to witness the moment, Rebecca's hands paused over her keyboard. Making coffee wasn't beneath her rank. Junior officers performed all sorts of tasks to support watch operations, but the context made it clear this wasn't about caffeine. This was about putting her in what Merrick considered her proper place. "Sir, I'm currently the only qualified ASW operator on watch," Rebecca said carefully. "If I leave my station, if there was anything worth detecting, one of the other consoles would have found it by now," Merrick interrupted. "Your screen shows the same nothing it's been showing for the past 3 hours. Go make coffee for the real officers who are actually contributing to combat readiness." The phrase "real officers" detonated in the quiet CIC like a depth charge. Commander Thornton stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Commander Hayes is the senior SW watch officer." Her expertise. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Is currently being wasted staring at a screen that shows absolutely nothing of tactical significance," Merrick finished. "She can make coffee and still keep one eye on her precious sonar display if she's that concerned about missing something." Rebecca's peripheral vision caught a flicker on her screen. A subtle change in the acoustic pattern at bearing 092. Her training kicked in automatically, her eyes tracking the anomaly even as her mind processed Merrick's order. There, a brief frequency shift in the ambient noise, lasting less than 2 seconds. Most operators would have dismissed it as biological activity or a temporary thermal layer fluctuation. But Rebecca's 9 months of classified training had taught her to recognize patterns that others missed. To see the ghost signatures that preceded confirmed contacts, her fingers moved across her keyboard, isolating the frequency band and running it through pattern recognition algorithms that most SW officers didn't even know existed in the system. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, I gave you an order," Merrick's voice cut through her concentration. "Step away from that console and go make coffee, now." The anomaly appeared again, this time with additional characteristics. Blade rate signature. Propeller cavitation at a depth consistent with a submarine running shallow. Distance approximately 12 nautical miles, bearing 092. Course converging with the carrier strike group. Rebecca's heart rate accelerated, but her hands remained steady. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the contact either revealed itself definitively or disappeared into the thermal layers. 90 seconds to choose between obeying a direct order from a captain who'd made his contempt clear, or trusting training that officially didn't exist, and expertise she couldn't prove. The Combat Information Center waited in tense silence, and Rebecca Hayes made her choice. 9 months earlier, Rebecca Hayes had received orders that changed everything about how she understood submarine warfare. Envelope arrived via special courier to her stateroom aboard the Roosevelt during their previous deployment. Inside was a single page with minimal text. Report to Naval Special Warfare Command, San Diego, California. NLT the 15th of June 2018. Classification TSSCI. Discussion of assignment. Details prohibited until arrival. Contact Commander J. Vickers, extension 4427. She'd never heard of Commander Vickers. A search through the Navy's directory system returned nothing. When she'd asked her department head about the orders, he'd simply said, "Follow them. Don't ask me questions I can't answer." 3 days later, she'd found herself standing in an unmarked building on the periphery of the San Diego Naval Base. far from the tourist areas and public facilities. The structure looked like a warehouse from the outside, but the security checkpoint rivaled anything she'd seen at intelligence facilities. Commander Vickers turned out to be a submarine officer with 20 years of experience hunting Soviet and Russian boats. He was compact, intense, and utterly humorless when it came to anti-submarine warfare. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he'd said during their first meeting in a windowless briefing room, "you've been selected for the Navy's Advanced Undersea Threat Recognition Program. What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that will restrict your career conversations for the rest of your naval service. If you choose to decline this training, you'll return to your ship with no career impact. If you accept, you'll spend the next 9 months learning capabilities that fewer than 50 naval officers currently possess. Decide now." Rebecca hadn't hesitated. "I accept, sir." What followed was the most demanding education she'd ever experienced. The program wasn't about learning new equipment or memorizing specifications. It was about developing an entirely different way of perceiving the underwater environment. The first month focused on acoustic signatures. Rebecca spent 8 hours daily in a sensory isolation room, listening to recordings of submarine contacts. Not just American boats, but Russian Akulas, Chinese Type 093s, Iranian Kilos, and platforms from a dozen other nations. She learned to distinguish between different propeller designs by the sound of their blade rate. She memorized the acoustic signatures of different hull materials, cooling systems, and machinery configurations. "A submarine is never truly silent," Commander Vickers had explained. "It's just quiet enough that most operators can't distinguish it from background noise. Your job is to hear what others miss, to recognize the patterns that indicate intentional evasion rather than natural phenomena." The second month introduced her to predictive modeling. She worked with oceanographers who taught her how water temperature, salinity, and current patterns affected sound propagation. She learned to visualize the ocean not as a uniform medium, but as a complex three-dimensional environment where sound bent, reflected, and channeled in ways that could hide or reveal submarine contacts. Master Chief Petty Officer Angela Torres, a sonar technician with 30 years of experience, became her primary instructor for practical applications. Torres had tracked submarines through some of the most challenging acoustic environments in the world, from the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf to the deep Pacific trenches. "The technology is a tool," Torres had said during one particularly frustrating training session. "But the real weapon is your brain. Computers can process data faster than you, but they can't think like a submarine commander. They can't anticipate what a thinking, adaptive enemy will do next. That's what separates adequate ASW officers from the ones who actually find boats." Rebecca absorbed the lesson and pushed harder. She began to see patterns in the acoustic data that her instructors hadn't pointed out, making connections between environmental conditions and submarine behavior that went beyond the standard doctrine. The third month brought live exercises against actual submarines. The Navy had arranged for friendly boats to act as adversaries, conducting realistic evasion scenarios while Rebecca tracked them from a shore-based facility. The submarine commanders had instructions to use every tactic in their arsenal: thermal layer exploitation, knuckles, decoys, sprint and drift maneuvers. She'd failed repeatedly at first. Contacts would appear, tantalize her with brief acoustic signatures, then vanish into environmental clutter. Submarine commanders would slip past her detection zones, appearing on the opposite side of the exercise area before she'd even realized they'd moved, but failure taught her more than success ever could. Each lost contact became a case study. What environmental factors had she missed? What assumptions had she made about submarine behavior that proved incorrect? What patterns in the noise had she dismissed as irrelevant? By the end of the third month, she was tracking submarines that other operators in the facility couldn't detect. Her success rate climbed from 40% to 70%, then to 85%. "You're developing hunter's intuition," Vickers had told her during a performance review. "That's the difference between competent and exceptional. Competent operators find submarines when conditions favor detection. Exceptional operators find submarines regardless of conditions because they think like their prey." The 4th and 5th months escalated the difficulty. Rebecca faced scenarios involving multiple submarines operating in coordinated patterns, hostile acoustic environments with heavy shipping traffic, and time-compressed situations where she had minutes to make decisions that would normally take hours of. Analysis. The instructors introduced psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, conflicting information from multiple sources, senior officers questioning her assessments and demanding she justify conclusions, simulated combat conditions where lives depended on her accuracy. "In real situations, you won't have the luxury of certainty," Vickers had explained. "You'll have incomplete data, time pressure, and commanders who need answers immediately. You have to learn to trust your training even when your conscious mind doubts itself." Rebecca discovered reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. She would spend 14-hour days in the training facility, then return to her quarters to study acoustic spectrographs and submarine tactics. Sleep became a tactical decision, something to be managed rather than indulged. The 6th month brought her face-to-face with the program's true purpose. She was introduced to intelligence analysts from the National Security Agency and the Office of Naval Intelligence. They showed her classified data on emerging submarine threats, platforms that hadn't yet appeared in standard Navy recognition guides. "The next war won't be fought against submarines we know everything about," one analyst had explained. "It'll involve boats using new propulsion systems, new acoustic suppression techniques, new operational patterns. We need ASW officers who can adapt to threats they've never seen before, who can recognize the signatures of innovation rather than just cataloged platforms." Rebecca studied intelligence assessments of Chinese submarine development programs, Russian advances in anechoic coding technology, and Iranian tactics for operating in shallow, acoustically complex littoral waters. She learned about non-state actors acquiring submarine capabilities, about the proliferation of diesel-electric boats to nations that had never operated submarines before. The 7th and 8th months focused on integration with broader combat systems. Rebecca learned to correlate sonar data with intelligence reports, satellite imagery, and electronic warfare intercepts. She practiced coordinating ASW responses across multiple platforms, directing helicopters, surface ships, and friendly submarines in coordinated search patterns. Commander Vickers brought in submarine commanders to lecture on tactics from the opposing perspective. These officers explained how they would approach a carrier strike group, what vulnerabilities they would exploit, what environmental conditions they would wait for. "Know your enemy," one commander had said. "I've spent my career thinking about how to sink carriers. Now I'm teaching you how to prevent that. The tactics I would use are the tactics you need to defeat. Put yourself in my position. What would make you feel safe approaching a strike group? What would terrify you? Use that knowledge." By the 9th month, Rebecca was operating at levels that amazed even her instructors. In one final exercise, she detected and tracked a Virginia-class submarine that had successfully evaded every other operator in the facility. The boat's commander, a veteran with 15 years of experience, had demanded to meet the person who'd found him. "How did you know I was there?" he'd asked, genuinely curious. "I used every trick I know. Thermal layers, biologics for masking, minimal speed to reduce machinery noise. What gave me away?" Rebecca had explained her analysis, the subtle frequency anomalies that didn't match biological sources, the pattern of thermal layer disturbances that suggested intentional exploitation rather than random variation, the absence of certain expected sounds in areas where the submarine had supposedly been. The commander had listened with growing respect. "You didn't just find me," he'd said finally. "You understood what I was trying to do and predicted where I'd go next. That's not detection. That's hunting." When the program concluded, Commander Vickers had given her a final briefing. "What you've learned here doesn't appear in your service record beyond a generic training notation. You can't discuss the specific capabilities you've developed. Most of your fellow officers will never understand what you're capable of because you can't explain it to them." He'd paused, meeting her eyes with absolute seriousness. "But when it matters, when a real threat appears and everyone else is missing it, you'll know what to do. Trust your training. Trust your instincts. And don't let anyone convince you that you're wrong when you know you're right." Rebecca had returned to the USS Theodore Roosevelt 11 days ago, slipping back into the normal watch rotation as if she'd simply been away for software training. Her department head knew she'd done something classified. Her fellow officers noticed she seemed different, more confident in her assessments, but attributed it to normal professional development. Nobody except Commander Vickers and the handful of instructors at the facility knew that Rebecca Hayes had become one of the most dangerous submarine hunters in the United States Navy. And now, in the pre-dawn darkness of the Combat Information Center, all of that training was about to prove its value in a way that would change everything. Rebecca's fingers remained on her keyboard. Her eyes locked on the acoustic signature that had just reappeared on her display. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with her training, a diesel-electric submarine running on battery power, attempting to use the thermal layer at 200 feet to mask its approach. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes." Captain Merrick's voice carried an edge now, the kind that preceded formal disciplinary action. "I've given you a direct order. Step away from your console and perform the task I've assigned." Around the CIC, the tension had become palpable. Petty Officer Second Class Jordan Chun, manning the surface contact tracking station 3 consoles away, glanced nervously between Rebecca and the captain. Lieutenant Shepard had stopped mid-stride, coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth, watching the confrontation unfold. Commander Thornton moved closer, her voice low and diplomatic. "Sir, perhaps we could have someone else handle the coffee while Lieutenant Commander Hayes. I don't recall asking for your input." "Commander," Merrick interrupted, his eyes never leaving Rebecca. "This is about establishing proper priorities and discipline in this watch section. Hayes seems to think her role here is more important than it actually is. I'm correcting that misconception." Rebecca's training warred with her instincts. Commander Vickers had emphasized the importance of trusting her analysis even under pressure. Even when authority figures demanded she ignore what her expertise told her. But he'd also acknowledged that disobeying direct orders carried consequences that could end careers. The acoustic signature strengthened slightly. "Blade rate consistent with a Kilo-class submarine, possibly Iranian given their proximity to the Strait of Hormuz. Depth approximately 180 feet, speed 4 knots. Bearing 092 and slowly, converging with the strike group's projected course." She made a decision that would define everything that followed. "Sir, I have a possible subsurface contact at bearing 092, Rebecca said, her voice steady and professional. "Requesting permission to remain at my station to develop the track." The cake went absolutely silent. Several sailors actually turned in their chairs to witness what was happening. Refusing a captain's direct order wasn't just insubordination, it was career suicide, especially when that captain had already demonstrated his hostility. Merrick's face darkened. "You have what you think is a contact, based on what? Some minor acoustic anomaly that your overactive imagination has decided is significant? Based on blade rate signature, propeller cavitation patterns, and acoustic characteristics consistent with a diesel-electric submarine operating at shallow depth." "Sir," Rebecca replied, her hands already working to isolate and enhance the signal. "The contact is converging with our course at approximately 4 knots. Let me see that display. Merrick strode to her station, leaning over her shoulder to examine the screen. His presence was deliberately intimidating, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. I don't see anything but noise and clutter. Point out this supposed submarine. Rebecca highlighted the frequency band on her screen, marking the periodic spikes that indicated propeller rotation. Here, sir. 7-blade propeller turning at approximately 120 RPM. That's consistent with a Kilo-class diesel boat running on battery power. The acoustic signature appears intermittently because the submarine is using the thermal layer for masking. But the pattern is distinct from biological sources. Merrick stared at the screen, his expression skeptical. That could be anything. Commercial traffic, biologics, equipment malfunction. You're seeing patterns that aren't there because you want to justify your position at this console. Sir, with respect, I'm trained to distinguish between environmental noise and submarine contacts. This signature has characteristics that, you're trained? Merrick's voice rose slightly. You've been doing this for what, 3 years? I've got sonar technicians on this ship with 15 years of experience. If there was a submarine out there, they would have found it by now. He straightened up and addressed the entire CIC. Does anyone else have this contact on their displays? Any other station showing a subsurface threat at bearing 092? Silence. The other operators checked their screens. But without Rebecca's specialized training and the specific search parameters she was using, the signature remained invisible to standard detection methods. Nobody else sees it, Merrick announced, as if this settled the matter. Which means it's either not there, or it's so insignificant that it doesn't warrant attention. Either way, you're relieved from that console. Lieutenant Shepard, take over the ASW watch. Rebecca's jaw tightened. She looked at Commander Thornton, hoping for support, but the senior officer's expression was conflicted. Thornton was caught between backing a subordinate and contradicting a captain, who had the political influence to make both their careers miserable. Lieutenant Shepard approached reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Ma'am, I can monitor the contact if you want to brief me on the parameters. The contact is intermittent, Rebecca said, beginning to stand. You'll need to focus on the 200 to 500 Hz band. Watch for periodic spikes every. She can brief you later, Merrick interrupted. Right now, Lieutenant Commander Hayes has coffee to make. Unless she'd prefer to explain to the captain why she's refusing to follow orders. The threat was explicit. Captain Lawrence Hendricks, the commanding officer of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, was Merrick's longtime friend and shared many of his traditional views about naval service. If Merrick reported insubordination, Hendricks would likely support disciplinary action without question. Rebecca stood slowly, her eyes returning to the display one final time. The acoustic signature was still there, slightly stronger now as the submarine apparently adjusted its depth or speed. Every instinct she'd developed over 9 months of intensive training screamed that this was real, that a hostile boat was approaching the carrier, that leaving this station was the wrong decision, but Merrick had given her a direct order in front of witnesses, and continuing to refuse would constitute clear insubordination. She could file a report later, document her concerns through proper channels, but at this moment, she had no authority to override a senior captain's judgment. She took one step away from the console. Petty Officer Chun, who'd been watching the entire confrontation from his position, suddenly spoke up. Sir, I'm showing something unusual on my surface plot. Multiple small contacts appearing intermittently at various bearings around the strike group. Merrick turned toward Chun, irritation evident in his expression. What kind of contacts? Fishing vessels, sir. At least 8 of them spread across a 40-mile radius. They appeared on radar about 20 minutes ago, but I thought they were just local traffic. Fishing vessels aren't unusual in these waters, Petty Officer. Why are you bringing this to my attention? Chun hesitated, then continued. Because they're not moving, sir. They're just sitting there, engines running based on the radar signatures, but they're not actually fishing or transiting. They're just positioned. Commander Thornton moved to Chun's station, studying his display. He's right, sir. 8 contacts, rough circle formation around the strike group at approximately 15 to 20 miles distance. That's an unusual pattern for fishing activity. Rebecca's mind connected the pieces instantly. Fishing boats as observation platforms. A submarine using their engine noise for additional acoustic masking. Coordinated positioning that would allow the boats to track the carrier, group's movements, and relay information to the submarine. Sir, Rebecca said, her voice urgent now. Those fishing vessels could be providing targeting data to the submarine contact I detected. This could be a coordinated approach using the boats as... Enough, Merrick snapped. You see a few fishing boats and immediately jump to some elaborate conspiracy theory? This is exactly the kind of paranoid overreaction that I've been talking about. Commercial traffic is common in these waters. Submarines don't coordinate with fishing boats in some elaborate tactical scheme. Actually, sir, that's a documented Iranian tactic, Lieutenant Shepard interjected quietly. They've used small boat swarms combined with submarine operations in previous exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. It's in the threat assessment briefings. Merrick's expression hardened. He wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by multiple junior officers in succession. I'm aware of the briefings, Lieutenant. I'm also aware that we've seen dozens of fishing boats in these waters over the past week, without any corresponding submarine activity. Correlation is not causation. He turned back to Rebecca. You want to be useful, Lieutenant Commander? Monitor those fishing boats from the coffee station. You can keep an eye on the radar display from there while you brew that pot I asked for 20 minutes ago. If they do anything actually threatening, you can alert the watch team. The dismissal was complete. Not only was he removing her from the ASW console, he was relegating her to the most junior task possible while sarcastically suggesting she could still contribute. Rebecca felt the eyes of every sailor in the CIC on her. This was the moment that would define how she was perceived for the rest of this deployment. If she complied now, she'd be seen as someone who backed down when challenged, someone whose expertise could be overridden by rank and gender bias. If she refused, she'd face formal charges that could end her naval career. Lieutenant Shepard had taken her position at Console 7. His fingers moving uncertainly across the keyboard as he tried to replicate her search parameters. He was a competent officer, but he didn't have her training. He didn't know what to look for, how to distinguish between the dozens of possible explanations for acoustic anomalies and the one that indicated actual danger. Commander Thornton caught Rebecca's eye, giving an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The message was clear. Don't make this worse. Take the loss now, document everything, and fight the battle through proper channels later. Rebecca walked toward the coffee station, each step feeling like a retreat from a battlefield she'd been ordered to abandon. The coffee maker sat on a small counter near the aft bulkhead of the CIC, positioned so that someone making coffee could technically still see some of the displays. Though from a useless angle and distance, she began the mechanical process of filling the machine with water, measuring coffee grounds, setting up the filter. Her hands performed the tasks automatically while her mind remained focused on that acoustic signature, still visible on Shepard's display from where she stood. Captain Merrick watched her for a moment, satisfaction evident in his expression. He'd reasserted authority, put an uppity female officer in her place, and demonstrated to the entire watch section who made decisions in his CIC. Much better, he announced to the room. Everyone has their proper role to play in combat operations. When we all remember that, the watch runs smoothly. He moved back toward the command chair, confident that order had been restored. And in that moment, on Lieutenant Shepard's display, The acoustic signature that Rebecca had been tracking suddenly strengthened dramatically. The submarine had changed depth, rising toward periscope depth in preparation for whatever action it had planned. But Shepard was still familiarizing himself with the console controls. He didn't notice the change, didn't recognize the significance of the shift in acoustic characteristics. Rebecca saw it from across the CIC, her stomach dropping as she realized what was happening. The submarine was preparing to attack, and she was 30 feet away from the only console that could track it, standing in front of a coffee maker because a captain's ego was more important than a credible threat. Assessment. She had perhaps 60 seconds to decide whether her career was worth more than 5,000 lives. Coffee maker burbled behind her as Rebecca made her decision. She crossed the Combat Information Center in 4 quick strides, moving past startled watchstanders who barely had time to register what was happening. Captain Merrick was mid-sentence in conversation with Commander Thornton when Rebecca reached Console 7. "Lieutenant, I need the station back," she said to Shepard. Her voice urgent but controlled. Shepard looked up, confusion evident on his face. "Ma'am," the captain ordered. "I understand what he ordered. Step aside, now." The authority in her voice came from 9 months of training with operators who didn't waste time on procedural debates when lives were at stake. Shepard hesitated for only a second before moving, recognizing something in her expression that transcended rank protocol. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes." Merrick's voice cracked across the CIC like a whip. "Return to your assigned position immediately." Rebecca's hands were already flying across the keyboard, pulling up acoustic analysis tools that most SW officers didn't know existed in the system. "Sir, the contact has changed depth and is accelerating. I have strong indication of a hostile submarine at bearing 087, range 11 nautical miles, heading directly toward the carrier. You have nothing but sensor ghosts and your own stubborn refusal to follow orders." Merrick snapped, striding toward her station. "I'm relieving you of watch duties effective immediately. You will torpedo in the water." The cry came from Petty Officer Chun, his voice climbing an octave with adrenaline. "Multiple active sonar pings detected. Bearing 085, classified as SET-65 torpedo, running hot and straight." The CIC exploded into controlled chaos. The general quarters alarm began blaring throughout the ship, a warbling tone that sent 5,000 sailors scrambling to battle stations. Commander Thornton lunged for the INC microphone to broadcast the warning to the entire carrier. Captain Merrick's face went white, then red. "That's impossible. There's no submarine." "Brace for evasive maneuvers." Rebecca cut him off, her training taking complete control now. She keyed the tactical communications net. "Bridge, CIC. Recommend immediate emergency turn to starboard, maximum rudder, all ahead flank. We have an incoming torpedo bearing 085. The carrier's bridge responded instantly, the officer of the deck having no time to verify the order through normal chains of command. The massive ship began its ponderous turn, 100,000 tons of steel and aircraft straining against momentum and ocean resistance. Rebecca's fingers never stopped moving across her console. She was tracking 3 distinct problems simultaneously: the torpedo's trajectory, the submarine's current position, and the optimal countermeasure deployment pattern. "Deploy acoustic countermeasures. Bearing 085, she ordered. "Launch pattern Delta 3, staggered intervals of 15 seconds. Shepard had moved to the countermeasures console, his hands shaking slightly as he executed her commands. "Countermeasures away, bearing 085, pattern Delta 3. On Rebecca's display, the situation unfolded in stark digital clarity. The torpedo was running at approximately 40 knots, closing the distance to the carrier with terrifying speed. It was a wake-homing weapon designed to track the massive disturbance created by a carrier's propellers. The emergency turn would help, but not enough. They needed to break the torpedo's lock. Second countermeasure deployment, Rebecca commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Bearing 090, pattern Echo 2. We need to create multiple false targets. The acoustic countermeasures were sophisticated devices that mimicked a ship's acoustic signature, creating phantom targets that could confuse incoming torpedoes. Deployed correctly, they could draw the weapon away from the actual vessel. Deployed incorrectly, they were useless. Rebecca had practiced this exact scenario 47 times during her classified training, facing simulated torpedo attacks in every conceivable configuration. She knew the Set 65's tracking algorithms, understood its decision-making logic, could predict how it would respond to different countermeasure patterns. Time to impact? Commander Thornton demanded, her professional composure barely masking the terror of the situation. 2 minutes. 40 seconds at current closure rate, Rebecca replied, her eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. The emergency turn is buying us time, but the torpedo is compensating. It's still tracking. Captain Merrick stood frozen near the command chair, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He opened his mouth, closed it, then seemed to physically shake himself back into the moment. What? What do we need to do? Rebecca didn't look away from her display. I need complete tactical control of countermeasure deployment and the authority to coordinate with the bridge on evasive maneuvers. If you can give me that, sir, I can save this ship. The admission of dependence on a junior officer he'd been humiliating minutes earlier must have cost Merrick something profound. But survival instinct overrode ego. You have tactical control. Commander Thornton, coordinate all stations through Lieutenant Commander Hayes. All stations. This is the Dow. Thornton's voice carried across the CIC. Combat Systems Authority is temporarily assigned to Lieutenant Commander Hayes for torpedo evasion. Execute all commands immediately without confirmation delays. Rebecca's mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface level tracked the torpedo's position, calculated intercept angles, monitored the effectiveness of deployed countermeasures. A deeper level was predicting the submarine's next move, anticipating how the boat's commander would react to the carrier's evasive maneuvers. Petty Officer Chun, what's the status of those fishing boats? She asked, her voice cutting through the alarm. KLA-XON, S. Chun checked his display quickly. No change, ma'am. Still stationary at their previous positions. They're observation posts, Rebecca said, more to herself than anyone else. Feeding targeting data to the submarine. Bridge, CIC. Recommend course change to heading 180. We need to break their line of sight. The carrier began another turn, its massive hull responding with agonizing slowness to the rudder commands. On the acoustic display, the torpedo adjusted its track, still locked onto the carrier's wake signature despite the countermeasures. It's not working, Shepard said, his voice tight with fear. The torpedo's still tracking true. It's working, Rebecca countered. The countermeasures are degrading its tracking solution. Watch the confidence interval on its approach vector. It's widening. She was right. The torpedo's path was becoming less certain. The weapon's guidance system struggling to distinguish between the carrier's actual signature and the false targets created by the countermeasures. Third countermeasure deployment, Rebecca ordered. Bearing 075, pattern Charlie 1. Deploy in 30 seconds on my mark. She was timing the deployment to coincide with the carrier's turn, creating a complex acoustic picture that would force the torpedo to make a decision at the worst possible moment. If she'd calculated correctly, the weapon would commit to a false target just as the carrier completed its evasive maneuver. 20 seconds, she counted aloud, watching the geometry of the situation converge. 15-10 mark. The countermeasures deployed, their acoustic signatures blooming on the display like flowers opening. The torpedo's track wavered, its guidance system processing multiple strong targets in rapid succession. "Come on," Rebecca whispered, watching the weapon's trajectory with absolute focus. "Take the bait." The torpedo's path began to curve away from the carrier, drawn toward one of the false acoustic signatures. The turn was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, then became more pronounced as the weapon committed fully to its new target. "Torpedo has lost lock," Chun announced, his voice cracking with relief. "It's tracking toward countermeasure set 3. Impact on a false target in 40 seconds. The CIC erupted in relieved exclamations and nervous laughter. Several sailors slumped in their chairs, the adrenaline crash hitting hard after the sustained terror. Commander Thornton closed her eyes briefly, offering what might have been a silent prayer, but Rebecca's expression remained intense focused. "The submarine is still out there." "Chun, what's the fishing boat status?" "Still stationary, ma'am. Wait. 2 of them are beginning to move. Bearing 060 and 095, both accelerating to approximately 15 knots. They're repositioning to regain observation," Rebecca said. "Lieutenant Shepard, I need you to calculate likely firing positions for a second torpedo based on those fishing boat movements. The submarine will try to maneuver into a position where their spotters can provide updated targeting." Merrick had recovered some of his composure, though he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. "You think they'll fire again?" "They expended 1 torpedo and missed. They'll want to confirm the result before withdrawing, which means they need their observation network to verify whether they hit or not. When they realize they missed," Rebecca's hands were already working the problem, plotting probable submarine positions based on the acoustic data she'd been tracking. "They'll either withdraw or attempt another attack depending on their rules of engagement and risk tolerance." "Can you find the submarine?" Thornton asked. "Get us a solid firing solution?" Rebecca studied her display, correlating acoustic signatures with the fishing boat positions and known submarine capabilities. "I have a probable position, but it's not precise enough for weapons release. The submarine commander is good. He's using the thermal layers effectively, minimizing his acoustic signature. I'd estimate position accuracy at maybe 60% confidence." "That's not good enough for a weapons release authorization," Merrick said, his voice still shaky but carrying traces of his former authority. "We need positive identification before we can engage." "Agreed, sir." Rebecca's eyes never left her screen. "But I can track him. If he makes another approach, I'll have enough data points to develop a firing solution. And if he withdraws," she highlighted a sector on the tactical display, "he'll have to transit through this area where the acoustic conditions favor detection. Either way, we'll get our positive identification." The Combat Information Center had settled into a tense watchfulness, the initial panic replaced by focused alertness. The torpedo they'd evaded had detonated against a countermeasure nearly 2 miles away, the explosion registering on seismic sensors, but causing no damage to the carrier. Petty Officer Chin spoke up again. "Ma'am, the fishing boats are changing formation. 4 of them are now moving to create a new perimeter at bearing 040 through 120. The others are maintaining position." Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind visualizing the tactical picture in 3 dimensions. The submarine was repositioning, using the fishing boats as a coordination network. The question was whether they were setting up for another attack or preparing to withdraw. "Commander Thornton," Rebecca said, "I recommend we launch the SH-60 Helo with a dipping sonar. If we can get active sonar coverage in Sector 37, we can force the submarine to either reveal itself or withdraw to deeper water where it loses the thermal layer protection." Thornton looked to Merrick, who hesitated only a second before nodding. "Make it happen. But I want that Helo to have fighter escort." If those fishing boats are part of a coordinated attack package, they might have surface-to-air capability. Good call, sir, Rebecca agreed. She was already coordinating with the carrier's air operations, vectoring assets into position for an integrated anti-submarine response. Captain Merrick approached her station slowly, standing to the side rather than looming over her as he had earlier. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Rebecca and Thornton could hear. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my thanks. If you'd followed my order, if you'd stayed at that coffee maker. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rebecca glanced up at him briefly. Sir, with respect, we can discuss this after we've neutralized the submarine threat. Right now I need to focus on making sure that boat doesn't get another shot at this carrier. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was professional prioritization, putting the mission ahead of personal grievances. Merrick recognized it for what it was and nodded. Stepping back to give her space to work, the next 20 minutes would determine whether Rebecca's disobedience had saved 5,000 lives or merely delayed the inevitable. The submarine was still out there, still dangerous, still intent on either confirming its kill or achieving it. And Rebecca Hayes, the female officer who'd been ordered to make coffee instead of doing her job, was now the only person aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt who could find it. The SH-60 Seahawk helicopter lifted from the carrier's deck at 0428 hours, its searchlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as it vectored toward the coordinates Rebecca had designated. Inside the CIC, she monitored its progress while simultaneously tracking the fishing boats and maintaining her acoustic search for the submarine. Hello is on station, the air warfare controller announced. Deploying dipping sonar now. Rebecca watched as the helicopter's active sonar began painting the underwater environment with sound pulses. A more aggressive approach than her passive listening techniques, but necessary to force the submarine's hand. If the boat remained in position, the active sonar would find it. If it fled, the movement would reveal its location. Contact. The helicopter's acoustic sensor operator transmitted over the tactical net. Submerged vessel, classified as diesel-electric, bearing 053 from hello position, range 4,000 yards, depth 210 feet. Contact is moving, course 170, speed 6 knots. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, correlating the helicopter's data with her own acoustic tracking. Confirmed. That's our shooter. He's withdrawing toward deeper water. Commander Thornton leaned over the tactical display. Do we have enough for a firing solution? Affirmative, Rebecca replied. Confidence level is now 92%. The submarine is a kilo class, almost certainly Iranian based on acoustic signature and operational area. Recommend we maintain tracking but hold fire unless he demonstrates renewed hostile intent. Captain Merrick, who had been conferring quietly with the ship's captain via secure phone, returned to the command area. Captain Hendricks wants clarification on the rules of engagement. The submarine fired first, which gives us legal justification for a defensive response. But higher command is concerned about escalation. They want positive identification of nationality before we engage. Rebecca had anticipated this. Sir, I can provide identification based on acoustic signature with high confidence, but visual confirmation would require forcing the submarine to surface, which increases risk to our assets. The alternative is to maintain tracking while we transit out of the area, denying them another attack opportunity. How long can we maintain tracking? Depends on the submarine commander's decisions. If he continues his current withdrawal course, we can track him for another 30 to 40 minutes before he reaches water deep enough to escape beneath the thermocline. If he attempts to reposition for another attack, Rebecca highlighted a sector on the display. We'll have multiple opportunities for engagement. The carrier's captain made the decision quickly, Maintain tracking. I want that submarine under constant surveillance until he's either surfaced for identification or completely withdrawn from the area. But I also want our strike group repositioned to minimize vulnerability. Commander Hayes, work with the destroyer squadron to establish an anti-submarine warfare screen that prevents any further approach. It took Rebecca a moment to register that Captain Hendricks had just promoted her by 2 ranks in his verbal reference. She wasn't a commander, she was a lieutenant commander. But the mistake, if it was one, suggested that in the heat of the crisis, her actual rank had become irrelevant compared to her demonstrated capability. Aye, sir. Coordinating the SW screen now. The next hour transformed the carrier strike group's formation from a standard transit posture to a defensive anti-submarine configuration. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the USS Michael Murphy and USS Jason Dunham, repositioned to create a protective barrier between the carrier and the submarine's last known position. The SH-60 helicopter was joined by a second bird, giving them overlapping sonar coverage of the withdrawal route. Rebecca orchestrated the entire operation from her console, coordinating between air and surface assets with the confidence of someone who'd trained for exactly these scenarios. The submarine continued its withdrawal, occasionally attempting to use thermal layers and ambient noise to break contact. But each time Rebecca predicted the maneuver and repositioned her tracking assets to maintain coverage. At 0547 hours, the submarine finally reached water deep enough to escape beneath the thermocline and disappear from their sensors. Rebecca marked the last known position and began drafting her initial incident report. Lost contact, she announced to the CIC. Submarine has successfully withdrawn to deep water, beyond our effective tracking range. Recommend we maintain heightened ASW posture for the next 6 hours in case of renewed approach. Commander Thornton authorized the recommendation and then turned to Rebecca. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the captain wants to see you in his cabin immediately. Captain Merrick will maintain tactical watch. Rebecca saved her work, briefed Merrick on the current tactical picture, and made her way through the carrier's passageways toward the captain's quarters. It was now after 0600 hours, and the ship was transitioning from night to day watch. Sailors heading to breakfast in the mess deck stepped aside as she passed, and she caught fragments of conversation that suggested the story of the torpedo attack was already spreading through the ship. Captain Lawrence Hendricks was a compact man in his mid-50s with a reputation for aggressive tactics and zero tolerance for incompetence. His cabin was Spartan, decorated only with a few naval warfare publications and a photograph of his family. He gestured for Rebecca to sit as she entered. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, I've been reviewing the CIC logs and communications from the past few hours. I want to hear your version of events, particularly the circumstances leading up to your detection of the submarine. Rebecca provided a concise summary, leaving nothing out, including Captain Merrick's order to make coffee and her decision to disobey and return to her station. She expected Hendricks to react negatively to the insubordination, but his expression remained neutral throughout her account. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up a flimsy message from his desk and handed it to her. This arrived from 5th Fleet Headquarters 20 minutes ago. They want a full after-action report on the incident, including detailed analysis of how we detected the submarine when our standard ASW procedures apparently missed it initially. They're also asking questions about our training protocols and whether we need to revise doctrine based on this encounter. Rebecca scanned the message, noting the classification level and the list of senior officers being copied on the correspondence. This was going to generate significant attention at levels far above a carrier captain. Sir, my detection methods involved techniques from a classified training program. I'm not sure how much detail I can include in an unclassified after-action report. I'm aware of your training status, Hendricks said. I received a call from Commander Vickers at NSWC about 30 minutes ago. Apparently, someone at Fifth Fleet contacted him asking about your capabilities. He was very clear that your training details remain classified. But he authorized me to confirm that your expertise is legitimate and that your detection of the submarine was consistent with your training objectives. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. What he also told me, off the record, is that you're one of about 15 officers in the entire Navy who could have found that submarine under those conditions. Which raises an interesting question. Why was someone with your capabilities standing watch on a routine transit, instead of being utilized in a specialized role where those skills are actually needed? Rebecca had no answer to that. The Navy's personnel system didn't account for classified training that couldn't appear in official records. As far as her detailer knew, she was a standard ASW officer with routine qualifications. I serve where I'm assigned. Sir, standard answer, but not particularly useful. Hendricks pulled out another document. I'm drafting a recommendation that you be assigned to the Carrier Strike Group Commander's staff as the Senior Warfare Coordinator. That position gives you tactical authority over all anti-submarine assets in the strike group and ensures your expertise is properly utilized. I'm also recommending you for immediate promotion to Commander and a Navy Achievement Medal for your actions this morning. Rebecca felt the weight of the recognition settling over her like a physical force. Sir, I appreciate the recommendation, but I should point out that I disobeyed a direct order from Captain Merrick. That's going to be in the logs. It is in the logs. Along with detailed evidence that your disobedience saved this ship and 5,000 lives. Hendricks's expression hardened slightly. Captain Merrick and I are going to have a private conversation about his judgment and his treatment of qualified officers. That's not your concern. Your concern is accepting this assignment and making sure we're better prepared if we face another submarine threat. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering technical details of the engagement, lessons learned, and coordination procedures with other strike group assets. By the time Rebecca left the captain's cabin, the sun had fully risen, and the carrier's flight deck was buzzing with activity. As aircraft prepared for morning operations, she returned to the CIC to find the watch section had changed, with fresh personnel taking over the consoles. Lieutenant Shepard approached her immediately. Ma'am, you're getting requests for interviews from multiple departments. The intelligence section wants a detailed brief on the submarine's tactics. The training department wants to know what detection methods you used. And the public affairs office is asking about releasing information to the media. Rebecca felt a headache beginning to form. Tell intelligence I'll provide a classified brief this afternoon. Tell training I'll work with them to develop improved ASW procedures within the limits of what I'm authorized to share. And tell public affairs absolutely not. No media interviews, no public statements beyond what the strike group commander authorizes. Yes, ma'am. Also, there's a message for you from Commander Vickers. He said to call him on a secure line when you have a moment. Rebecca made her way to the communications center and placed the call. Vickers answered immediately. Hayes, I hear you've had an interesting morning. That's one way to describe it. Sir, I've been fielding calls from admirals asking questions about your training that I can't fully answer. The Fifth Fleet Commander is particularly interested in whether we have other officers with your capabilities and why they're not being properly utilized. I imagine that's creating some awkward conversations. Sir, awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Vickers's tone softened slightly. But more importantly, are you okay? I know that training prepared you technically, but actually facing a live torpedo attack is a different psychological experience. Rebecca considered the question honestly. I'm processing it, sir. The training gave me the tools to respond effectively, but you're right that the emotional reality is different from simulations. I'll be fine. Make sure you talk to someone if that changes. The Navy has resources for combat stress, and there's no shame in using them." He paused. "I also want you to know that what you did this morning was exactly what we trained you for. You trusted your expertise even when authority figures questioned it. You made the right call under impossible pressure. I'm proud of you." The words carried more weight than any medal recommendation. Commander Vickers wasn't given to empty praise. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." After the call ended, Rebecca made her way to the junior officer berthing area and her tiny stateroom. She had 6 hours before her next watch rotation, and she needed sleep desperately. But as she lay in her rack, her mind continued replaying the morning's events. The submarine had been real. The torpedo had been real. If she'd obeyed Captain Merrick's order, if she'd stayed at that coffee maker instead of returning to her console, the USS Theodore Roosevelt might now be a debris field spreading across the Arabian Sea, but she hadn't obeyed. She'd trusted her training, her instincts, and her expertise over the opinions of a senior officer who'd let bias cloud his judgment. The consequences of that decision were still unfolding. Merrick would face questions about his conduct. She would receive recognition that would raise her profile throughout the Navy. The story would spread, transformed and embellished with each retelling, until it became legend. And somewhere in the depths of the Arabian Sea, a submarine commander was reporting back to his superiors that the American carrier they'd tried to sink had somehow detected them despite perfect conditions for a stealth approach. That report would generate its own ripple effects, causing adversaries to reconsider their assumptions about American ASW capabilities. Rebecca finally drifted toward sleep with one thought echoing through her exhausted mind. She'd proven that excellence couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Regardless of who tried, the Navy, and Captain Merrick specifically, would have to reconcile themselves to that reality. 72 hours after the torpedo incident, Rebecca stood in a packed briefing room facing 43 officers from across the carrier strike group. The atmosphere was charged with professional curiosity mixed with barely concealed skepticism. These were experienced warfare commanders, many with decades of service, and they'd been summoned to hear how a lieutenant commander had detected a submarine that their collective systems had missed. Rear Admiral Patricia Corrigan, the strike group commander, sat in the front row with her arms crossed. She was a no-nonsense aviator who'd commanded fighter squadrons before rising to flag rank, and her expression suggested she was reserving judgment until she heard something that impressed her. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," Admiral Corrigan began, "we've all read the incident reports. What we need to understand is whether your detection was the result of replicable techniques that we can incorporate into our standard procedures, or whether it was simply exceptional luck that happened to work out in our favor." Rebecca had prepared for this question. She advanced her presentation to a slide showing acoustic spectral analysis. "Ma'am, it wasn't luck. The submarine was exploiting known gaps in our standard ASW search patterns. Specifically, our reliance on automated detection algorithms that filter out signals below certain confidence thresholds. I detected the contact by manually analyzing frequency bands that our automated systems had already dismissed as environmental noise." A destroyer captain in the third row raised his hand. "Commander Hayes, I've been doing ASW for 18 years. What you're describing sounds like you were staring at raw sonar data, looking for patterns in random noise. That's not a sustainable watchstanding practice." "You're correct that it's not sustainable for most operators, sir," Rebecca replied. "But it is possible for personnel with specialized training to recognize signatures that automated systems miss. The question isn't whether we can put every SW officer through that level of training. We can't. The question is how we position our most capable operators to maximize their effectiveness." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a proposed reorganization of Strike Group ASW coordination. "I'm recommending we establish a centralized, ASW coordination cell that pools our most experienced operators across all platforms. Instead of having each ship independently monitoring its assigned sector, we create a collaborative network where specialized expertise can be applied to ambiguous contacts anywhere in the formation. The briefing continued for 90 minutes, with Rebecca fielding increasingly technical questions about detection methodologies, false alarm rates, and operational sustainability. Some officers were genuinely interested in learning new approaches. Others seemed determined to find flaws in her recommendations that would allow them to dismiss the entire incident as an anomaly. Admiral Corrigan finally called a halt to the questions. "Commander Hayes, your proposals have merit, but they require resources and reorganization that I can't authorize without demonstrating proven effectiveness. Here's what I'm prepared to do. We're conducting a major anti-submarine warfare exercise in 6 days as part of our transit through the Gulf of Oman. 3 Allied submarines will attempt to penetrate our defensive screen and simulate attacks on the carrier." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You'll have tactical control of all Strike Group ASW assets for the exercise. If you can detect and track those submarines using the methods you're proposing, I'll authorize the reorganization and push your recommendations up to fleet level. If you fail, we stick with current doctrine and you go back to being a standard watch officer." Fair enough. Rebecca felt every eye in the room on her. This was the real test, not just of her individual capability, but of whether her approach could work at an operational scale with multiple assets and complex coordination requirements. "Fair enough, ma'am. I accept those terms." The next 6 days passed in a blur of preparation. Rebecca worked 18-hour days coordinating with ASW officers across the strike group, briefing them on her detection techniques within the limits of what she was authorized to share, and establishing communication protocols for the exercise. Not everyone was cooperative. Several senior officers made it clear they resented taking direction from someone they viewed as a junior officer, who'd gotten lucky once and was now overstepping her expertise. Captain Merrick, though officially supportive following his conversation with Captain Hendricks, maintained a cool professional distance that suggested their relationship would never fully recover. But Rebecca also found allies. Commander Sarah Jacobson from the destroyer Michael Murphy proved to be an exceptionally skilled SEO tactician who grasped Rebecca's concepts immediately. Lieutenant Kendra Park, the ASW officer aboard the cruiser Lake Champlain, had instincts that suggested she'd benefit from the same kind of advanced training Rebecca had received. Together, they built a coordinated search plan that integrated passive sonar, active helicopter dipping operations, and sophisticated environmental analysis to create overlapping detection zones across the strike group's defensive perimeter. The exercise began at 0600 hours on a clear morning with moderate seas. 3 submarines, an American Virginia class, a British Astute class, and a French Barracuda class, had been given 24 hours to study the strike group's formation and develop attack plans. They were operating under realistic combat conditions with experienced commanders who knew every trick for evading detection. Rebecca positioned herself in the carrier's CIC with direct communication links to every SW platform in the formation. Admiral Corrigan observed from the Flag Operations Center, monitoring but not interfering. The first 4 hours passed with no contacts. The submarines were being patient, studying the acoustic environment, waiting for optimal conditions. Rebecca used the time to refine her search patterns, directing assets to focus on areas where environmental conditions favored submarine concealment. At 10:47 hours, Lieutenant Park aboard the Lake Champlain reported a possible contact at extreme range. Acoustic anomaly, bearing 215, intermittent signature consistent with machinery transients. Confidence level is 40%. 40% was below the threshold for standard contact reporting. The kind of uncertain signature that most operations centers would ignore. But Rebecca had trained Park to report exactly these kinds of ambiguous detections. Lake Champlain, this is Hayes. Classify that contact and begin tracking. I'm vectoring Seahawk 2-3 to your sector for active prosecution. Over the next 30 minutes, Rebecca coordinated a careful approach that neither alerted the submarine nor lost contact. The helicopter's dipping sonar confirmed what Park had detected. The British astute-class submarine attempting to use a deep scattering layer to approach the formation. First contact confirmed and tracked. Rebecca announced to the tactical net. Submarine Alpha is classified and under continuous surveillance. He's no longer a threat to the strike group. 1 down, 2 to go. The American Virginia-class boat proved more challenging. Its acoustic signature was specifically designed to defeat U.S. detection systems, and its commander knew American ASW doctrine intimately. Rebecca tracked him for 2 hours through a combination of environmental analysis and predictive positioning, eventually catching him as he maneuvered for a simulated torpedo shot. But the French Barracuda was exceptional. Its commander was using tactics that Rebecca hadn't seen before, exploiting biological noise layers in ways that created phantom contacts throughout the search area. For 6 hours, Rebecca repositioned assets, eliminated false tracks, and refined her search parameters without success. Admiral Corrigan's voice came over the command net at 18:30 hours. Commander Hayes, the exercise window closes in 90 minutes. If that French boat gets a simulated shot off at the carrier, the exercise is scored as a failure. Rebecca stared at her displays, analyzing everything she knew about submarine tactics, environmental conditions, and the particular capabilities of the Barracuda class. The boat had to be somewhere in the western sector, using the complex thermal structure there for concealment. But where exactly? She closed her eyes, visualizing the 3-dimensional underwater environment, the way Commander Vickers had taught her. Think like the submarine commander. What would make him feel safe? What vulnerability in the strike group's formation would be most tempting? Her eyes snapped open. All ASW units, new search focus. Bearing 270, range 15,000 yards. Seahawk 4-1. Deploy dipping sonar at coordinates ... She rattled off a position that was outside the established search pattern, in an area that conventional doctrine suggested was too shallow for submarine operations. Ma'am, that water is only 300 feet deep, the helicopter pilot objected. The environmental brief said submarines would avoid that sector. Trust me. Deploy the sonar. 60 seconds later, the helicopter's acoustic operator reported, contact. Submarine designated Charlie, bearing 265, range 14,000 yards, depth 220 feet. Classification, Barracuda class. Contact is maneuvering toward the attack position on the carrier. Rebecca coordinated the prosecution with practiced efficiency, vectoring assets to bracket the submarine and deny it any approach vector to the carrier. The French commander, recognizing he'd been detected, transmitted his simulated withdrawal and surfaced to end his portion of the exercise. Admiral Corrigan's voice carried unmistakable satisfaction. All 3 submarines were detected and tracked. Exercise terminated. Commander Hayes, that was exceptional tactical coordination. All units, secure from a SW exercise and prepare for debrief at 2,100 hours. The CIC erupted in congratulations and relieved laughter. Rebecca accepted the praise with quiet professionalism, but inside she felt the validation of everything she'd trained for, everything she'd advocated for in her briefing. She'd proven it wasn't luck. It was skill, training, and a different way of thinking about submarine warfare that could be taught and replicated across the fleet. The debrief that evening lasted 3 hours. Rebecca walked the assembled officers through each detection, explaining her tactical reasoning and the environmental factors that had guided her asset positioning. The French submarine commander, Capitaine de Frigate Michel Rousseau, attended via video link and offered grudging respect for her prediction of his unconventional shallow water approach. "Most ASW coordinators think in 2 dimensions," he said in accented English. "You think in 4-3 spatial dimensions plus time. You anticipated where I would be, not just where I was. That is the difference between adequate and formidable." After the formal debrief concluded, Admiral Corrigan asked Rebecca to remain behind. When the room emptied, the Admiral's demeanor shifted from professional assessment to something more personal. "Commander Hayes, and yes, I'm using that rank because your promotion just came through from the Pentagon. I need to be direct with you about what happens next." Rebecca straightened in her chair, sensing the weight of what was coming. "Your performance over the past week has generated attention at levels you probably don't fully appreciate. The Chief of Naval Operations received a personal brief on the torpedo incident. The Secretary of the Navy is asking questions about our SW training pipeline. And several allied navies are requesting information about our detection capabilities." After word leaked about the exercise results, Corrigan pulled out a folder marked with security classifications. "You're being offered 3 options, and you need to choose one within 48 hours. Option 1. Return to Commander Vickers's program as a senior instructor, training the next generation of SW specialists. Option 2. Assignment to the Office of Naval Intelligence as a submarine threat analyst, working directly with national-level intelligence on emerging underwater capabilities. Option 3. Remain with this strike group as my SW warfare commander, with a mandate to implement the organizational changes you proposed." Rebecca absorbed the magnitude of each choice. They represented completely different career trajectories, each with profound implications. "Ma'am, may I ask which option you think would be most valuable to the Navy?" "That's not the question you should be asking," Corrigan replied. "The question is which option allows you to have the greatest impact doing work that matters to you personally. All 3 are valuable. All 3 need someone with your capabilities. But only you can decide where you belong." That night, Rebecca stood on the carrier's sponson, a small platform extending from the ship's hull that offered a rare moment of privacy and fresh air. The Arabian Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, dark water meeting darker sky at an invisible horizon dot. She thought about the 9 months of training that had transformed her capabilities. The torpedo attack that had validated those capabilities under the worst possible circumstances. The exercise that had proven her methods could work at scale. And now, choices that would define the rest of her naval career. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Park. "Whatever you decide, thank you for showing us what's possible. You changed how I think about this job." Similar messages had arrived throughout the evening from officers across the strike group. Some thanked her for the training. Others expressed hope that she'd stay to continue mentoring them. A few simply acknowledged that watching her work had altered their understanding of what expertise looked like. Rebecca realized that the impact of the past week extended far beyond detecting submarines or winning exercises. She demonstrated that excellence couldn't be dismissed by rank, gender, or institutional bias. That expertise, grounded in rigorous training and proven performance, demanded respect regardless of where it came from. She'd also learned something about herself. For years, she'd kept her head down, avoided conflict, sought approval from superiors who often didn't recognize her capabilities. The classified training had given her technical skills, but the confrontation with Captain Merrick had given her something more important: the confidence to trust her own judgment, even when powerful people disagreed. The coffee maker incident had become legend throughout the fleet. The story had been embellished and mythologized, transformed into a parable about gender discrimination and vindication. But the real story, Rebecca knew, was simpler and more profound. It was about a moment when competence mattered more than compliance, when saving lives required disobeying orders, when doing the right thing meant accepting consequences. 2 days later, Rebecca sat across from Admiral Corrigan and delivered her decision. "Ma'am, I'm choosing option 3. I want to stay with the strike group and implement the SW reorganization." Corrigan nodded slowly. "Why that option?" "The instructor position would let you shape hundreds of future officers. The intelligence role would put you at the strategic level of submarine warfare." "Because the strike group is where the mission happens," Rebecca replied. "Training and intelligence are important, but this is where we actually hunt submarines and protect the fleet. I can make the biggest difference right here, right now. Working with the officers I've already started building relationships with. Even knowing that Captain Merrick will still be part of this command structure, that you'll have to work with people who resented your success." Rebecca met the Admiral's eyes steadily. "Especially knowing that, ma'am. If I leave now, it sends the message that exceptional performance isn't enough if you make powerful people uncomfortable. I'd rather stay and prove that competence ultimately matters more than politics." Corrigan smiled for the first time in the conversation. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. Welcome to my staff, Commander Hayes. Your office is being prepared now, and we'll announce your assignment at tomorrow's command briefing." The announcement generated mixed reactions across the strike group. Some officers were genuinely pleased to have Rebecca's expertise formally integrated into their operations. Others viewed her rapid advancement with suspicion or resentment. Captain Merrick maintained professional courtesy but never quite met her eyes during their subsequent interactions. Rebecca didn't seek his approval, or anyone else's. She focused on building systems that worked, training officers who wanted to learn, and ensuring the strike group's ASW capabilities reached levels that would deter any adversary from attempting what that Iranian submarine had tried. 3 months later, Rebecca stood in the same CIC where she detected the torpedo attack, but now as the strike group's SW warfare commander. The carrier was transiting through the South China Sea, an area where submarine contacts were routine and the underwater environment was among the most complex in the world. A young lieutenant named Amanda Foster sat at Console 7, Rebecca's old station, tracking multiple contacts with the focused intensity of someone still proving herself. "Commander Hayes," Foster called out, "I have an acoustic anomaly at bearing 115. It's below the confidence threshold for automated detection, but the pattern looks artificial rather than biological." Rebecca moved to Foster's station, examining the display. The signature was subtle, the kind of contact that most operators would dismiss. But Foster had been trained in Rebecca's methods, taught to recognize exactly these kinds of ambiguous signatures. "Good catch, Lieutenant. Classify it and begin tracking. I want to see how you develop this contact." As Foster worked the problem with growing confidence, Rebecca realized this was the real victory. Not the medals or the promotion or the vindication against those who'd underestimated her. The victory was building a team of officers who saw the underwater environment the way she did, who trusted their expertise even when the evidence was uncertain, who understood that excellence required pushing beyond comfortable standards. Admiral Corrigan appeared beside her, watching Foster work. "She reminds me of someone," the Admiral commented quietly. "She's better than I was at her experience level," Rebecca replied honestly. "She doesn't second-guess herself the way I used to. That's because she has a role model who showed her what's possible. You changed the culture of this strike group, Commander. That matters more than any single submarine detection." As Rebecca watched her team operate with precision and confidence, she reflected on the journey from that pre-dawn confrontation over a coffee maker to this moment of quiet professional satisfaction. The path had been difficult, marked by resistance and conflict and moments when career suicide seemed inevitable. But she'd stayed true to her training, trusted her capabilities, and refused to accept that being underestimated defined her limits. And in doing so, she'd proven something that extended far beyond anti-submarine warfare, that excellence, grounded in genuine expertise and demonstrated under pressure, ultimately transforms not just individual careers but entire organizations. The Navy would never again dismiss someone's capabilities simply because they didn't fit traditional expectations. Rebecca Hayes had made certain of that, and somewhere in the depths of the Arabian Sea, submarine commanders from multiple nations were revising their approach tactics, knowing that the American fleet's SW capabilities had evolved beyond their previous understanding, all because one officer refused to make coffee when she knew there was a submarine to find. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.